Welcome to Insights for Manufacturing, the podcast that supports the UK manufacturing sector. Hosted by Jeff Beecham, the Manufacturers Recruiter. Welcome to Insights for Manufacturing. Today, we're going to be discussing sustainability in manufacturing, and I'm proud to welcome my guest along, Adam Dickins, who is the Director at A.D Frameworks. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Hi, thanks very much for inviting me along, Jeff. Look forward to having a good discussion with you. I know you've got some good questions lined up for me, so.
Well, you may think they're good, but we'll see. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. It was nice to meet you, by the way, at the PPMA show a few weeks ago, and this is where we sort of met and had a general intro and overarching discussion about sustainability. So let's get straight into it. What sparked your interest in sustainability in the first place, Adam?
My interest around sustainability has actually been there for a good many years. So over 20 years ago, I did a degree in product design, innovation, and eco-design. So it goes all the way back to then. But after that, unfortunately, didn't get any design jobs. So went into various other jobs, as you do from finishing uni, and fell into facilities management. And have actually had a 17, 18-year career within facilities management, where actually a lot of those principles of energy management, efficient buildings, good workflows, have all been present within those kind of roles and those responsibilities. So it's very much been an ongoing thread, I guess, within my work. And more recently, to kind of branch into doing my own consultancy has been, how do I take those 18 years of experience and actually create better connections, enable more businesses to have some insights and grow and develop themselves. And that's where that kind of shift from being employee to consultant has kind of come from.
Yeah, fantastic. So how do you define sustainability within the context of UK manufacturing, and why is it particularly important now? I mean, we've all heard about net zero, carbon neutral, sustainability. They're all the sort of typical buzz phrases. Some people understand them more than others. But it's absolutely critical in manufacturing. But why is it so important at the moment?
I mean, the fundamental basis of all the sustainability work that from governments, from COP21, where the first global agreement was actually signed, is all about limiting global warming to under 1.5 degrees centigrade from base points, which is in the pre-industrialization.
Okay.
And we are very much at that tipping point of we will or won't achieve that. And the consequences of that are global, from sea levels rising, as we experience already, very erratic, changing weather environments. We're going to more extremes and more erratic weather patterns, which, we experience in the UK. Spain, just yesterday with severe flooding, taking out areas. And it's those abnormal weather patterns and what have you that are being triggered by climate change. So that's why it's really critical, because the impacts are so visible now. 20 years ago, it was a thing and it was all very scientific and theory. We're now very much seeing the impacts of climate change in our day-to-day life very much. And it is a tipping point for companies to really engage with it. The government net zero policy to be net zero by 2050 is to overall emit no carbon. So we may have to capture some carbon because some industries, such as the glass industry, need to use gas to heat glass to form the bottles and everything else. So not all industries are going to be able to go to fully electrification,
Yeah.
as an example. So some industries may have to still use gas, but that will need to be offset in a way. And it's how that's done is still to be worked out and understood.
Yeah.
But for manufacturing industries in general, it's really difficult to pin down because each manufacturing firm is different. They have their own requirements, their suppliers have their different scales, their
Yeah.
customers may have bigger influences. They may be liable within the company's house reporting to report their carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And that's where some of that, the tendering, they're pulling in what their supply chain is doing. So it's really difficult to pin down one thing as for UK or manufacturing as a whole or UK manufacturing, this is it.
Yeah.
Because each company will be different. But there are some common threads, acknowledging that you have an impact, on the environment, whether that's your local environment, whether it's how you use energy, how you use fuel, things like that. And then setting an action plan. How do I get better? And that's what at the moment it is very much pushing towards is that incremental movements to go from I'm here, how do I get to being in a better position?
Yeah. So, what are some of the really big challenges then for UK manufacturers at the moment when they're looking to implement sustainable practices? Because there's going to have been a lot of change in certain processes, certain materials, energy. The list is probably endless. But when it comes to sort of implementing sustainable strategies, what are the sort of hurdles that you're seeing mostly for UK manufacturers?
At the moment, there's kind of three.
Okay.
And you mentioned it earlier, getting past those buzzwords. There are so many, they get thrown around like confetti at
Yeah.
times,
Yeah.
which helps. All that they do at times is muddy the water because actually different people's interpretation of a buzzword is different to somebody else's. So you've
Yeah.
actually at times got to dig behind what they're actually saying from that one buzzword to actually what they're actually going to do about it.
Okay.
Um, and because of that, that almost brings in a fear of greenwashing
Yes.
and green hushing. So you go from a fear of greenwashing that you don't want to say because you don't want to get pulled up because what you've said was slightly wrong or not quite
Yeah.
true, not
Yeah.
quite open and honest. But actually, you then fall into green hushing, which is a company that is doing good but doesn't want to say. So it goes unspoken and unseen, and which is a real shame because there's a lot
Yeah.
of companies that are doing really good things, but they're
Yeah.
fearful of actually making that statement of this is that positive thing that we've done. To think that of sustainable practices, quite often it's seen as it's got to be this big revolution,
Mm.
this massive change. We're throwing everything out that we're doing. We're actually quite often it's incremental improvements and it's you don't have to stop everything you're doing because a lot of what you are probably doing is good.
Yeah.
It's just making those changes, making those investments as you would normally invest in new equipment and what have you to gain efficiencies, gain those technical advantages which help commercially
Yep.
as well as environmentally. So they're probably kind of the three challenges, and that kind of latter one is that investment and that reinvestment is that challenge that, sustainability isn't free.
Yeah.
It does require investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing that. I'm just sat here now thinking about SMEs, and I keep talking about SMEs because most of the businesses in the UK are SMEs.
Yeah.
So there are lots and lots of different sort of strategies, and as you say, incremental sort of gains along this path to net zero. But I mean, if you had to pick a handful or couple of really effective strategies that SME manufacturers can adopt to reduce their environmental impacts, what would you say are the quick wins or the low hanging fruit that could sort of start moving that needle quickly?
I don't, there are no golden bullets of do X, you'll save loads of energy,
Okay.
or you'll save load of materials. But actually, the wins are that small manufacturers can implement and start looking at is look at what data you have available. Because
Okay.
so many companies that I speak to will go, oh, I'm going to, change all my lighting to LED and I'll save loads of energy. And it's like, but you're ignoring that massive HVAC plant that is supporting your entire production facility, which just eats energy.
Yeah.
So yes, it's easy to implement, but it's not your actual biggest issue. So
Okay.
actually understand where your energy goes, understand where your materials go, and that can be done in a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
Very superficially, most manufacturers now have half-hour meter data. So if you contact your supplier, they can provide you with a very big spreadsheet of your energy consumption per 30 minutes.
Yep.
And you can do some quite quick and easy manipulation within Excel and using pivot tables to actually get it to a point that you can actually see what your main trends are.
Yeah.
So you can identify actually we have a base amount of energy consumption that is disproportionate to our production level. Well,
Okay.
what's going on? What are those? And then you can dig further into that. So
Yep.
there is potentially free information out there, which they need to just contact a supplier to get.
Okay.
From there, start getting into more detail. There are very good metering platforms and systems now which require minimal infrastructural work. So you don't, with things like LoRaWAN as a network, wireless network system, you can have a whole variety of sensors, electric meters, all sorts that can be wirelessly installed into a manufacturing facility,
Yep.
down to individual production lines and what have you. So you can start getting more detail to help identify, well, where are my biggest energy draws
Yeah.
within your facility?
Yeah.
So actually start getting into that information. And then further on from that, I would consider doing organizational carbon footprinting. So that
Okay.
starts looking at your scope one is your direct emissions.
Yep.
So that would be your gas for your heating your building or production processes, fuel in vehicles that you operate. Scope two is your indirect emissions. So that's primarily your electrical supply.
Yep.
And then scope three is the one that gets really, really messy and complicated because that's looking at your up and downstream materials and product supply chain.
Right. Okay.
And this is actually where you may think that you're doing really great strides and what have you because you've made great shifts in your energy use from gas to electricity. But actually, the materials you're using are really environmentally impactful.
Yeah.
So I think you've got to look at things holistically. And actually, if
Yep.
you can start picking some of those elements out and what you kind of want to identify is kind of it's a scale, but you want to start identifying your two ends of your scale. One is what, like you say, what is your company's quick wins? And that may be different from one company to another. And that may
Yeah.
be moving from gas to electric or going for that electrification. But the other end of the scale, which will take more time, more investment, is materials.
Yeah.
How do you close that production loop so you end up with a circular economy, which takes much more time, much more investment, and
Yeah.
needs engagement of your wider supply chain?
Yeah.
So that, yeah, there's not a silver bullet. And I'm not going to sit here and go, do X, you'll do everything and you'll be golden because it's not that simple, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
that's I think the bit that going back to your previous question is that fear of doing something because they're doing something different to everybody else that they work alongside because what they
Yeah.
do, you know, companies are successful because they have a unique selling point. So what they do is different to everybody else in theory. So what their sustainable interventions are going to be slightly different to everybody
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
So one shoe doesn't fit all, unfortunately. So yeah.
Wow. So, I mean, it's like with anything in business, you're always going to get some quick wins, some low hanging fruit. But I guess what you're saying is some of the more costly or time consuming activities for carbon reduction um, might take a lot more planning. They're more difficult to get to the bottom of. But I think if you're making that investment, it's going to have a much bigger impact. So there
Yeah,
might be things you might have one thing in your factory or in your process that's responsible for, I don't know, 50% of your carbon footprint. As like you say, if you're just changing some lights to LEDs, you can do that fairly quickly,
yeah,
but it's not going to push the needle very much. So maybe
no,
get all your efforts into what's causing the biggest
yeah,
part of the
and
footprint.
and it's how you finance those things
Yeah,
because they're going to be the bigger ticket items, whether like it's materials research or a
yeah,
significant piece of equipment.
yeah,
But how do you finance that? Do you couple it, as a business to a much more commercially profitable intervention, but you couple it with a slower payback piece of work? So you end up pushing out your payback of your very commercially driven investment with a
sure.
slower payback, and you balance those payback periods back.
Yeah,
I've seen companies do that and actually do it really successfully. So yes, your commercial investments, your very commercially focused investment may get pushed out 2 years from, it may double its payback period from 2 years to 4 years.
yeah,
But it means that sustainable investment has gone from 10 years to 4 years.
right. I've got you.
And
Okay.
and you do that balance, and it really helps that supporting those other interventions to be justifiable within a commercial world. But it does take that dynamic and looking at those two elements, that commercial, but also those environmental, and they both need to commercially work.
Yeah, yeah,
Because the most successful environmental business is a successful business. If you lose that commercial element, it doesn't matter how much you throw at stuff, if that makes sense.
yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, we've just had a budget, which is probably painful for most people. So we're not going to
Yeah.
bang on too much about that. Everybody's probably sick of that topic already. But are there any sort of government policies, or what do you think from government is going to influence sustainability efforts in manufacturing? And anything specific, or any initiatives that are you know
Uh,
working well, or likely to work?
some of them are working well. So
Okay.
the fact that companies with over 250 employees or a turnover, I'm going to get this number wrong now, uh, 35 million, I think. So large businesses,
Yeah.
according to government and companies' house reporting standards, need to report their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And they're having now to report that. So this is how the government gets some of their environmental impact information from industry,
Okay.
is through the company's house reporting process.
Yeah.
And it's also those larger companies which are within their tender questionnaires are asking those questions of, do you have 14,001? If not, can you answer these other 5 questions?
Yeah.
And a number of companies that I speak to invariably come to me initially going, we want 14,001. How do we get it? And
Yeah.
it's my first question after that is, why do you want it? Oh, because we want to tick this tender form. And it's like, it's easier just to answer the other 5 questions.
Yeah.
And ISO is a brilliant standard and it's a brilliant management system, but it's a lot of work to get it and to maintain it. And in terms of answering those other 5 questions, I've worked with clients and we do it with 2 documents, a really good, robust environmental policy and an action plan. And they're active documents. And it's something that I talk a lot with clients about is do that, make it part of the conversation and put the time and the effort into the stuff that's going to make a difference.
Yeah.
So, but that's why those questions come out, is to try and get those conversations going. And I think the other big push, which is around the utilities element, is
Okay.
the push for electrification. So ultimately, gas is going to be phased across to something else. I don't think they'll be able to get rid of gas completely because there are certain industries that need those high temperatures from
Yeah.
metal fabrication or metal work, glass production. There are industries that need high temperatures, and that is most effectively and efficiently done with combusting a gas.
Yep.
Whether there's a change in gas, who knows? But that's going to take quite a bit of change of technologies and development. But the impacts of that electrification to businesses, I mean, if we look at kind of the average gas price at the moment, it's about 8p a kilowatt.
Yeah.
Your electric is about 25p. So it's 3 times the price to do the same thing. If you're talking about heating a building,
Yeah.
it's going to take 3 times the cost. And so there is that cost impact. Yes, it's lower emissions, but the grid isn't green. It's still a little over 50% fossil fuel driven.
Yeah.
So the grid isn't green. It's getting better, and that for the government, that is why there is that big push towards the government net zero policies are around that electrification and getting the grid to be greener. But there's also rabbit holes that government policy are sending people down, in my personal and commercial view.
Yeah.
In terms of things like EVs and the personal tax allowance on EVs. I think that is a bit of a rabbit hole, ultimately. I think government policy is going to be behind the curve. I think there's already 2 or 3 major car manufacturers that have turned around and said, we're ceasing development of EVs. We're
Yeah.
focusing on to hydrogen. And government policy is behind the curve on that. But then that's what happened with diesel cars 10, 15 years ago with
Yeah.
Personal tax allowances on diesel cars. So we'll see where that comes out in the wash. But yeah, I think they're a bit behind the curve on that. But yeah, their main kind of push at the moment is around electrification, biodiversity, and so those elements. So how companies, and there aren't, for manufacturing businesses, not huge incentives around those. So
Yeah.
I think with that push to electrification, whether it does mean that smaller scale PV installations become more justifiable.
Okay.
Feed-in tariffs are not worth the money, really. But actually, if you can offset your electrical costs, and if you're talking 25p a kilowatt, depending on your building size, you can quite quickly actually offset a cost, and
Yeah.
that payback period becomes actually reasonable given the length of life expectancy of a PV installation.
Yeah.
So, but there again, much longer term views. So it's companies taking that very long term view of their energy use, where their energy comes from. So that there are those investment conditions to think about.
Yeah, I guess that's I mean, just on the sort of long-term view thing, for a very small company, I guess sometimes it's quite difficult to see what's going on much further than 6 months down the line in some cases, or worst case scenario, 2 or 3 months down the line. But to try and get an SME to take a gamble, I suppose, on something that hopefully would pan out over the longer term. Yeah, it's going to be difficult for some, isn't it? So
it really is. But there are private businesses that do enable those funding streams. And there are various, and I'm not going to get into the details and the mechanics of those because that's kind of not for me the point of this conversation. But I think there's going to be a shift of potentially, buildings that are leased, that actually there is more requests for, I want the building to have PV.
Right.
So it's a part of that built structure. And the PV technology is moving on constantly. From very flexible systems that can be stuck onto a, corrugated roof building. Certainly the more modern industrial, where you've got kind of a wide span between the kind of ridges,
Yeah.
they can stick it literally into those recesses, and your installation costs are much smaller. So I think potentially more new industrial buildings are going to have more of those requirements.
Yeah.
Certainly within domestic properties, there are more things that developers need to do to be able to get planning, building regs, approvals. Commercial isn't quite there, but I think it's going to come through, because you think about the roof area of a commercial building, it's ripe for putting PV on.
Yeah.
We're putting them into farmers' fields, which just seems counterintuitive, that we're limiting growing crop for humans to put electricity generation, when we have so much commercial building property and assets. We should make use of those. They're easier to get to, easier to maintain. There's electrical infrastructure there already. So
it's a bit of a frustration for me, driving along up and down the country, and you see these fields, some of them are right by the side of some of the motorways, you got these solar panels stretched out for, hundreds of meters at a time. And but there's another thing. I mean, I'm not I don't know enough about this stuff myself, but we do import an awful lot of food, don't we? And I think I'm a bit of a foodie, so my shopping is quite varied, and there are some weird and wonderful ingredients and things that you can't get in the UK. We just don't grow it. But I think choice is one of the reasons behind a bigger carbon footprint, isn't it? Because we're just moving stuff all around the world. Some countries need it just to survive, but here in the UK, we do all right as a country. We all moan that it's not as good as it should be, but we're doing all right in the overall scheme of things. But we've got fields just, they should be growing more of this. We should all be eating more stuff that's grown locally, shouldn't we, really? And maybe this whole, the customer's always right. Customer can have whatever they want, when they want it we want it now, we want it yesterday. I think every single one of us has sort of contributed to this whole scenario where we're forcing more miles, whether that's on, container ships or, boats, aircraft, lorries coming across the continent, whatever it might be. I'm sure, we could do a lot more ourselves here. Okay, our diets might be a little bit more simple, but it's all about survival, isn't it? Rather than living to eat. I certainly need to lose a bit of weight, so there's a lesson for me anyway. Eat to live, not the other way around. But
that takes consumer choice.
It does.
I think if consumers were making those environmental decisions, the supermarkets would follow, and it would fall through the supply chain.
Do you think
there is a risk?
Do you think the supermarkets would do that?
I think if people stop buying stuff, yes.
Okay.
Why do they want to stock something if they're not selling it? So if there was enough consumer demand, and unfortunately, I think that's the problem, as you said, people want it now.
Yep.
The most sustainable thing you've got is the thing you already have. So, I listen to the radio, and you hear Vodafone, O2, and what have you going, oh, you can have the latest iPhone and replace it every year. It's like, what's wrong with it within a year?
Yeah.
I mean, my current phone I've had for over 3 years, and it's still going strong. It does everything I want it to do. This consumer need to replace and have the latest whiz pop thing is one of those environmental issues.
Yeah.
But that is a big shift in consumer behavior, and it will take, I think, something significant for that to change. And I don't know whether the supermarkets will do that, because if they don't all do it, they're going to be worried about their competitiveness.
They're going to lose competitive advantage, absolutely.
But from a manufacturing point of view, if that were to suddenly happen overnight,
Mm.
that diversity in that range of manufacturing that is in the UK, that is that part of those food industry, manufacturing industry,
Yeah.
there would be a shock of an impact on those supply chains for that,
Yeah.
because a lot of those products are all coming from different manufacturing plants. So there's an economic risk to that as well of that sudden shock. And I don't think we will be at that shock point, but I do very much agree in terms of reducing those food and production miles. And I'm going to include production and manufacturing within that, because
Yeah.
how many components, how many parts for a piece of equipment are bought from the continent or further afield than that, as you
Yeah.
say, on a container ship, bringing stuff more onto our shores for production, whether that is going to be a push and a trend of people looking at their environmental impact. And, one of their quick wins, as we are talking about, could be, well, I'm going to stop buying it from China because the metal is the metal, and I can buy it from the UK and save myself X tons of CO2 just in shipping.
Yeah.
Is that going to, be one of those levers that pulls that commercial decision? So I think that's where that kind of fuller assessment comes in terms of what's your shipping impact, what's your materials impacts. It's going to be all those elements, and trying to come with a balanced view of, and it will be a compromise. And
Yeah. Absolutely.
eco design, it is a compromise between most optimal. Yeah, you may have a slightly poorer quality material choice. There will be a compromise, whether it's cost, quality, or emissions impacts from
Yeah.
shipping and what have
Yeah.
you. It's finding those ways to be able to assess the benefits and the drawbacks, and being able to get a balanced view of where you're making those compromises, and
Yeah.
being open about that you've had to make those compromises, that um, yes, you're buying from the main continent in Europe because manufacturing prices are lower, in part because the energy price is lower.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And, because parts of the continent are much further along the line of greener energy, it may actually have a lower impact because they use less carbon
Yeah.
to produce their electricity. So
Yeah.
there may be all sorts of compromises that go into that mix. So it's not straightforward and clear decisions. And yeah.
It's a minefield, isn't it? The whole sustainability topic. We've got the ideological utopia, but then actually, making it all happen where businesses can still operate, still make a profit, still keep people employed. It's like everything else I keep saying on most of these podcasts. Most things need to be in balance, usually, and it's just very complex. I don't think I've got the bandwidth to understand in finite detail how all of that works. It just seems like an absolute minefield, and that's why there's people like you out there, sort of specialising in this topic. And just before we sort of finish up, Adam, I mean, it's been a fantastic conversation, but if anybody wants to reach out to you to understand what services you're providing.
Yeah.
What's the best way of getting hold of you? I think you've got a website, haven't you? Can you just share those details?
Yeah. So website is adframeworks.com. And there's an inquiries form and stuff on there. Or if you want to email inquiries at adframeworks.com, they're probably the two quickest routes to reach out. I also have a LinkedIn page and what have you. So do feel free to reach out. I can share some links with you as well, Jeff, if that's helpful.
Brilliant.
But I think if we're kind of getting to a point of kind of wrapping up slightly, there's kind of three things I would say to any SME that wants to do more, or the one of the managers wants to do more about it and is important to them. There's probably three things I would say to do. The first is get it onto the meeting agenda, talk about it, and agree amongst your management team what sustainability means to you as a business.
Yeah.
And have that common language, because if people are coming at it with a different view and a different thought, you get the miscommunication from the early doors. So actually get it on the agenda, talk about it. From that, develop a good, robust environmental policy, which you can share with your customers and share with your suppliers with an action plan. That's formulates what you've agreed in your management meeting.
Sure.
And then make it a day-to-day activity conversation when you're making those business decisions. Acknowledge that, is this a compromise we're happy with? Where do we take this? How do we try and make an improvement in this area whilst we do this? Make it part of that day-to-day conversation. Don't bring it out as the thing that you talk about when you're trying to win the new customer, because it shows really quickly when it's not a day-to-day conversation. And when, if you're having it as that day-to-day conversation, it doesn't matter who ends up in front of the customer or the supplier and what have you, because you're all talking from the same common view of what it means to you and your business.
Yeah.
And I think they're the three most important things, for companies that don't know where to start, is just start simple, start with that, make it day-to-day conversation, and it will grow from there.
Changing the behavior, isn't it? It's that it becomes a habit then, doesn't it? And everybody's switched on to the same thing.
It gets rid of that green hushing, because it's common. Absolutely. Because you talk about it, you're comfortable with it. You're not uncomfortable talking about it.
Yeah. Super. Well, Adam, it's been a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you very much for joining me on Insights for Manufacturing. That wraps up today's show. So thank you to our audience, whether they're listening on Spotify or whether they're watching this on YouTube. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time on Insights for Manufacturing. Bye-bye.